I was on a first date and we'd run out of conversation topics after 20 minutes, and there was this horrible awkward silence, and I panicked and just started laughing for no reason, and my date looked at me confused and asked what was funny, and I said, oh, nothing, just remembered something, and kept laughing, and she said, what did you remember? And I said, just a thing from earlier, and she said, what thing? And I realized I'd backed myself into a corner where I had to invent a funny memory that didn't exist. I told her I'd seen a squirrel do something weird on my way to meet her, and she asked what the squirrel did, and I said it fell off a branch, and she said, that's not really funny, that's kind of sad. And I said, no, it was fine. The squirrel was okay, it just looked surprised, and she said, okay, but why are you still laughing? And I realized I was still fake laughing about a fake squirrel incident, and I was in too deep to stop, so I just kept going, and she started looking around like she was planning her escape route. The laughing went on for probably 30 seconds, which doesn't sound long, but when you're fake laughing with no actual reason, it feels like an eternity, and other people in the restaurant started looking at us, and my date said, are you having some kind of episode? And I said, no, I just think the squirrel thing is really funny, and she said, you're still on the squirrel, and I said, I have a vivid imagination, and she said, clearly, and I finally forced myself to stop laughing, but then there was silence again, so I started laughing again, and she said, okay, what now? I told her I was nervous, and laughing was my nervous response, and she said, that's the most anxious thing I've ever witnessed, and I said, I'm aware it's a problem, and she said, have you considered just sitting in silence instead of manic laughing? And I said, no, that feels worse, and she said, it definitely doesn't feel worse than this, and honestly, she had a point, but I couldn't stop, and every time there was a pause in conversation, I'd feel the laugh building up and have to force it down. We somehow made it through dinner, and when the check came, there was a moment of silence while we waited for the waiter, and I felt the laugh coming, and I bit my tongue, literally bit it to stop myself, and she noticed and said, did you just hurt yourself to avoid laughing? And I said, yes, and she said, that's dedication to the bit, and I said, it's not a bit, it's a curse, and she said, I think this might be the weirdest date I've ever been on, and I said, same, and we both actually laughed for real that time. She texted me later and said she had fun despite the psychological warfare I'd waged against silence, and asked if I wanted to go out again, and I said only if you're okay with potential random laughter, and she said she'd mentally prepare herself, and we went on a second date, and I managed to only fake laugh twice, which she said was improvement, and I said I was working on it, and she said, maybe get a therapist, and I said, that seems extreme, and she said, you're literally injuring yourself to avoid awkward silence, and I said, okay, fair point. Oh, we've been dating for 6 months now, and she's learned to recognize when I'm about to start fake laughing, and we'll just start talking to fill the silence before I can, and I asked her if that was annoying, and she said it's better than the alternative, and I said, what's the alternative? And she said, you laughing about imaginary squirrels for 30 seconds straight, and honestly, I can't argue with that, and now my nervous laugh is like our inside joke, and sometimes she'll reference the squirrel incident, and I'll say that squirrel was real, and she'll say, no, it wasn't, and I'll say, prove it, and she'll say the burden of proof is on you, and we'll argue about a squirrel that never existed, and somehow that's become our relationship dynamic.